study designs. Now, as we begin to move forward on our journey together, I do want to point out this video will concern itself only with the various times the model was used leading to its disappearance in the 1970s. As such, we will not discuss any use of the model in finished film footage on the TV series in the 1960s. Instead, we will stay entirely with our behind-the-scenes approach. For information on every shot of the model ever made to use in a television episode, check out our special video on the film effects library that Desilu made that was specific to the 3-foot model only. In early November 1964, Richard Dayton was retained by the Howard Anderson Company to build 2 models of the Starship Enterprise. The first was a 33-inch model intended to be a reference model for Roddenberry to use in determining the final design details of the full-sized studio model, which would end up being 4 times its size, or 11 feet, 2 inches. About a month later, Dayton delivers the completed 33-inch model to the Desilu lot while shooting for the original Star Trek pilot is still active. What you see here are 2 photographs. The one on the left is of Dayton holding the model for Gene Roddenberry, and the one on the right is of actor Jeffrey Hunter holding the model for Roddenberry. This particular shot would represent the very first time we would get what most people would consider to be a beautiful shot of the Starship Enterprise. Also, this was the configuration they would use to film every Enterprise shot in the cage, with the exception of the one 11-foot model shot where the camera zooms in on the bridge. Now later, just around Christmas time of the same month, shooting on the cage wrapped, so they took one more opportunity to this time take some other footage that they would be able to use as a reference library on the 3-foot model. These beautiful black and white photographs show you some of the angles that were used in these shots. And indeed, most of the effects shot on the 33-inch model throughout the entire series were shot in this session.
Hello, how are you doing? My name is Leo. I'm calling from Sacramento, California. I just happened to see your video on YouTube today about Star Trek and the Star Trek world. My comment is about the mystery ship, or the Lee Ferguson ship that was created by AMT. I actually purchased one of those, and I've had it hanging up in my bedroom since 1976. Far beyond the glow-in-the-dark status, I think, but it's been around for at least 50 years hanging in my household. So some of us still are aware of that model, and some of us still have it. Anyway, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
So needless to say, after the cage wrapped up and we knew we were going to be moving on to the second pilot where No Man Has Gone Before, there were some publicity photos that were taken by Desilu to be used in various press releases announcing the new TV series. Many of the photos that you see on the screen right here adorned magazines and newspapers all around the United States. I've included some other photographs on the lower part of the page which show you the model after its very last configuration change when it was made to match the 11-foot model in production of the TV series, and they took just a few more shots of the model with Shatner and Nimoy. And 2 years after the first time he brought the model to Roddenberry, Dayton brought it back to Roddenberry one last time after doing some final modifications that Roddenberry asked for, pressing it to service a microphone stand, which was a gooseneck arm mount on a wooden base, that had been specifically requested to make it easier to display the model. This was the last time he ever worked on that model. The images that you see here on the left-hand side of the screen are a contact sheet depicting the various high-resolution photographs that were obtained while they shot the very last set of photos and video to ever be used on this model. Now, roughly another year would go by before the model would be pressed into service once again, this time allowing the Viewmaster Corporation to photograph it for use on the Star Trek Viewmaster reel for the Omega Glory. 2 of the photos taken were of the 33-inch model. The rest of the images that you see as the USS Exeter in the background were pressed into service from an AMT model kit. Now, after Star Trek had gone off the air, Paramount had given Gene Roddenberry the 3-foot model as a memento from his time with Star Trek. And here you see a variety of candid photographs taken over the years. The 4 photos on the opposing left and right edges of the screen were taken in Gene's backyard in 1974. The main photo you see in the center of the screen is probably the most famous photo of the 3-foot model that had ever been taken. It also, unfortunately, would prove to be the last time that Gene Roddenberry would ever see the model again. because sometime in 1978, Roddenberry had loaned the 3-foot model to Robert Abel and Associates, who were working on Star Trek the Motion Picture. But the problem was that in February of 1979, Robert Abel and the people working for him were all released from Star Trek the Motion Picture due to an immense disagreement in the quality of the work that they had been doing. Some of those people actually were rehired by Paramount to help complete the film, but the 3-foot Enterprise that had been delivered to Robert Abel was never seen again. This prompted Gene to write the letter that you see here on the screen, basically laying out the situation. Namely, somebody had asked John Povil if they could use the model for something they were doing for Star Trek. John took the request back to Gene. Gene said, sure, gave John the model. John then took the model to Robert Abel and Associates, dropped it off physically at one of their locations. This was confirmed personally to me by Susan Sackett, who did in fact tell me they absolutely gave it to one of his locations. The problem was, after the movie had completed filming and Gene went back to Robert Abel to pick up the model, they said they didn't know anything about it. And of course, unfortunately at the same time, when John Povil was questioned about who he actually gave the model to, he couldn't really remember who he gave it to or where it went. This particular lapse in memory would fuel conspiracy theories for decades to come. But now Robert Hollingsworth was an artist whose most famous work is a sculpted death mask of King Tut, which he then made into holographic reproductions that were sold all over the world and were probably the last widely available Burton Holmes International product on the market. The original model, missing for decades, well, it was found in a storage unit in 2007. So how does that fit into our story? Actually, quite simply. You see, a funny thing happened to the Enterprise on its way to Robert Abel Associates. If you have any videos, photos, or documents that you would like to donate to us, please feel free to send them to jim@trek-world.com or submit them via the web at submit.trek-world.com. And that story begins with a request that Paramount made to a company called HoloLabs to create a special hologram display for a private cast party celebrating the release of Star Trek the Motion Picture. No one really remembers exactly who made the request, but the company that was asked to produce the hologram was HoloLabs, which was a joint endeavor between Burton Holmes International and Multiplex Company. BHI would operate a showroom named Odyssey Image Center on Sunset Boulevard to showcase the holographic work that they did as HoloLabs. Multiplex employee Joe Belt confirmed in 2015 that the hologram was commissioned as a decoration for the cast party at the opening night of the movie. This all fell into place for me when I stumbled across this picture here. Upon looking at it, it should be fairly clear for you to be able to recognize that it's not really a photograph. It's actually a picture of a hologram. Which hologram, you ask? Well, this is the finished hologram produced by HoloLabs. This hologram is from a private collection, and it's unknown if any more were ever made, nor how many were made just for that particular party. My guess is probably just this one, maybe another. It is unknown to this date as to how many more of these were made, and were they ever used anywhere other than that one cast party on that one night. Now, one of the things you'll notice when staring at this hologram intently enough is that it appears to have lights. Well, they accomplished that magic using reflective tape, the same reflective tape that would puzzle authenticators in early April of 2024 when they examined the model after it had been found and couldn't determine why the reflected tape had been put on the model. The authentication was arranged by Heritage Auctioneers, and the authenticators involved, among other people, were Doug Drexler, Darren Dockerman, Mike and Denise Sakuda, and Rod Roddenberry. Now, it is important to note that they did actually consider modifying the model for lights. It was they who placed the note concerning voltage and amperage needed for the lights on the base of the model as shown. It was not just a note that Dayton had scrawled across the bottom, as a lot of people believe. Here, you can actually see the actual film frame from the film that was shot to create the hologram. That frame comes from a 20-second piece of film that Multiplex had sent over to CFI Hollywood to be developed and returned for mastering the hologram. The film was discovered and identified, of course, by folks out on the internet. It's from 1978, and it is only one of two possible reels in existence. The original reel was obviously used by BHI to create the multiplex hologram. The film that these clips are from is from a copy that was found in storage of reels that belonged to CFI that were never actually returned. There was a major loss at the CFI warehouse years and years ago, and information concerning anything you find that's associated with multiplex. A lot of the people who are in the know about films basically joke that CFI basically means you can't find it. There's just no documentation out there. One thing that is of interest, though, is that a lot of people believe that the film came from Paramount. It did not. It came from multiplex. But we'll have more about that in a moment. Now, as I mentioned, the original 20-second clip was unfortunately destroyed by a very well-meaning and well-known slide vendor. And I want to thank that exact same slide vendor, Rex, thank you very much, for providing some of this footage to me at a very reasonable price. The fact of the matter is, folks, unlike every other slide you've ever seen of Star Trek, there are no multiple copies of this. When Rex's slides are gone, there's not likely to ever be any more copies of these to show up anywhere, which makes them, right now, probably the rarest Star Trek film slides ever made. And finally, what you see here now is a 20-second recreation of what that film would have looked like had it not been cut up. The work involved in this was done by Carl Tate, where he took 45 individual slides and interpolated what movement would be needed to get from one slide to the next. I've taken that clip, removed the background so that it can be used as an overlay, and I've also upscaled it to 4K for better clarity. Perhaps, in the near future, someone with skills that are far better than mine or Carl's could actually take those same 45 clips and make a completely distortion-free motion video from them. So now we know that BHI and HoloLabs actually had the model and they created the hologram. But this is where things began to go off the rails. The entire existence of HoloLabs and BHI was troubled as they were always short of operating funds. This is a condition that would be the final contributing factor in the disappearance of the model. One quote on the internet says, BHI was always short on cash. Would have gone under long before this if it had not been for people willing to work with little or no pay. Infusions of cash from Mallet and a landlord who rarely asked for rent. The Palmer family of Los Angeles had owned many properties, and the BHI offices were in what was at one time called the Palmer Building on Sunset Strip. The last member of that family, Mrs. Palmer, had been a close friend of Burton Holmes, and for his memory, rarely asked for BHI to pay rent when it was due. BHI always tried to pay the rent, and when money came in, they would eventually could put it on the account, but they never really caught up. In recognition of the writing being on the wall, cinematographer Bill Cartwright, aided by two friends, spent days analyzing each and every frame of film that BHI had and cataloging it in an archive for future generations. Later, Cartwright would be quoted to go on and say, then in the next 4 years, the Burton Holmes Company and the archives fell off the radar screen. It's now a lost treasure, and there's not a hint of how such an important collection could have been lost. It was too large a collection to be casually disposed of, and no one could actually have been so unaware of its money value, even if they didn't realize its historical importance. The real question is, does it still exist, and in what condition, and where? Now, unfortunately, the catalog that Caldwell produced was produced well before the Enterprise hologram and the associated film had been shot. And then in 1985, the building that housed BHI's Odyssey Image Center got sold. The contents of the entire building were packed up and placed in storage. Those contents included the 3-foot model, which had never been returned to Paramount via Robert Abel's team, as well as literally the entire storefront from the Odyssey Image Center containing their inventory, equipment, window signage, and more. One of the owners of BHI, Robert Hollingsworth, signed the lease on the storage unit in 1985. 4 years later, he was taken from his family way too soon as a result of congestive heart failure. and the secrets contained within 3 storage units in Van Nuys died with him. Then, 2 years later, in 1991, David Ziegler of the UCLA Art Library said that at the time of his death, Robert Hollingsworth had a storage locker at Public Storage in Van Nuys, which contained more than 1,000 slides that he had borrowed back from UCLA, but never returned. The first storage unit was discovered in 2004. Reels were found belonging to BHI. Note that at that time, the Hollingsworth family was approached by someone who said that the model was likely in that storage unit. The Hollingsworths waited for a follow-up communication, but it never came. And as the decades went by, it was once again forgotten. The next storage unit went up for auction by Public Storage due to unpaid bills. Ironic, isn't it? The same problem for BHI 40 years later. It's kind of a miracle, really, I think, that the storage unit didn't go on auction decades before now. Now, opening up that storage unit are 4 photos of the various display units belonging to BHI that were found. They were used to display holograms produced for Star Wars and for McDonald's, amongst others. And the 2 gentlemen from the area, Dustin and Jason, were the buyers of that storage unit. If nothing else but by that feat alone, their names are now forever interwoven as a part to Star Trek history. So Dustin and Jason, welcome to the family. For the record, they also bought that last known storage unit soon afterwards. But that is a story for another day. And as for me, I have my own little private piece of history from my personal collection. This 9-frame film sequence from the original video shot for the hologram, as well as the photo of the label on the box that reads USS Enterprise Multiplex. And this beautiful professionally mounted slide, courtesy of Rex, who is a well-known provider of slides in Illinois. And that frame shows the exact same instant the hologram featured in the photo that I got from the Multiplex collection. Now, if I only had that hologram. So now let's get up with the fun stuff, like this right over here.